The glass case holding Wade Kessler's medal was smashed by two men the moment they saw it. Broken glass hit the floor. One of them knocked the case off its stand. The other ripped the pension letter off the wall, pinned right beside Wade's photo, and tore it in half. Survivor benefits are terminated, effective today. One of them barked it straight into Diane Kessler's face. Diane Kessler stood frozen in the doorway of her own home. Broken glass and paper lay scattered across the floor, in the same room where Wade's funeral flag still sat folded neatly on the mantel. 34 years old, a hospice nurse. That medal was the only thing the city had ever given Wade that wasn't a bill or a broken promise. Now it lay shattered on her living room floor. Diane reached for her phone, dialed the number Wade had made her promise, years ago, she would only ever use once. Stay with us, because 2 days later, 500 Hell's Angels members walked into that building and did something that left the entire room speechless. Now, let's find out what happened that day. One of the men had a clipboard. The other had a crowbar he hadn't used yet, still hanging from his belt like he was hoping he wouldn't need it. "Who signed this?" Diane said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She'd learned that in 12 years of hospital rooms, the voice could hold even when nothing else did. The one with the clipboard didn't look up. Pension board. Chairman's office. He tore a receipt off a pad and held it out to her like he was handing back change at a gas station. "You can appeal. Forms on the city website. He died pulling 3 people out of a flood. That's not what's in the file." Diane looked past him at the mantel, at the flag still folded into its triangle, at the empty stand where the medal used to sit. 6 days ago, a man from the mayor's office had shaken her hand on the courthouse steps and told the cameras that Wade Kessler represented everything this city stood for. 6 days. Next door, a curtain moved. Ruth Callahan had lived beside the Kesslers for 11 years, and she was already on her porch by the time the two men reached their car, watching them go with her arms crossed and her jaw set the way it got when something needed remembering exactly right. Diane didn't call the police. She'd tried that channel 4 days earlier, over the missing parking placard, and been told that seized items pending reclassification review were not eligible for a police report. She didn't call a lawyer either. Gerald Voss, the only attorney in Millhaven who returned her call, had listened for 6 minutes and then told her, gently, that overturning a unanimous pension board vote without new evidence was close to impossible, and that his retainer started at $4,000. She had $1,100 in her checking account. Diane knelt down instead, among the broken glass, and picked up the 2 halves of the pension letter. She didn't read them again. She already knew every word. Then she walked to the kitchen drawer where she kept things that didn't belong anywhere else. Spare keys, a church bulletin from Wade's funeral, a folded envelope with her name on it in his handwriting, given to her the week before the flood, the week before any of this. She hadn't opened it until 3 days ago. Inside was a single card, a phone number in Wade's handwriting, and 6 words beneath it. "If it's ever this bad, call." Diane had read those words a dozen times since the funeral without dialing. Reading them felt like keeping Wade close. Dialing them felt like admitting she'd run out of everything else. She didn't feel that way anymore. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd been sitting the night the sheriff's deputy came to tell her about the flood, and she dialed the number with a steadiness that surprised her. It rang twice. "Sutter," a voice said, older, unhurried, in a way that made the word carry more weight than a louder man's shout would have. Diane's throat closed for a second before she found her voice. "My name is Diane Kessler," she said. "I'm Wade's wife." There was a pause on the other end. Not a long one, just long enough for her to hear something shift. "I know who you are, ma'am," the voice said. "We've been waiting on this call for 6 days." "They came to my house," Diane said. "They took his medal. They tore up the pension letter in front of me. Stay with this." What Diane didn't know yet was that the number Boone was already forming in his head had nothing to do with lawyers. Another pause. When Boone Sutter spoke again, his voice hadn't gotten louder. It had gotten quieter, the particular quiet of a man deciding exactly how many words a thing deserved. "Give me your address," he said, "and don't sign anything else." Diane gave it to him. "One more thing," Sutter said. "Is there a hearing? A date? A room? Anything official?" 2 days. Tuesday morning. City Hall, 3rd floor. The line was quiet for a moment. "Tuesday morning," Sutter repeated, like he was writing it somewhere that mattered. "We'll be there." He hung up before she could ask what that meant. Diane sat at the table for a long time after that, the phone still warm in her hand, the broken glass still scattered across her living room floor, the flag still folded on the mantel the way Wade would have wanted it. She didn't know yet what "we'll be there" was going to look like. Neither did Vernon Atkins, 60 miles away, already drafting his remarks for a Tuesday morning hearing he expected to last 4 minutes. To understand how a man like Atkins ended up standing in that hearing room at all, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the afternoon he decided that Wade Kessler's death was worth more to his campaign unrecognized than it had ever been worth to the city honored. Vernon Atkins was losing, and he knew it 11 weeks before anyone else in Millhaven did. Not by a landslide, nothing so simple as a scandal or a single bad headline. Just the slow erosion that happens to men who have spent 6 years in a job that stopped exciting anyone a long time ago. Chairman of the City Pension Board had once been a stepping stone. Atkins had believed that the day he took it. Now it felt like the whole staircase had been quietly removed while he wasn't looking, and the state auditor's race, the one he'd been positioning for since the spring, was slipping away one poll number at a time. 14 points behind. In 5 months. He had spent those 6 years the way careful men spend most of their careers, approving budgets on time, keeping the fund's numbers exactly where the annual audit expected them, shaking the right hands at the right dinners. None of it had ever made the newspaper. None of it had ever needed to. Chairmen of pension boards were not supposed to be visible. They were supposed to be reliable, the way a bridge is reliable, noticed only if something goes wrong. Something had gone wrong now. Just not in the way Atkins would have chosen. A challenger 20 years younger than him had entered the state auditor's race in March, with a slogan about transparency and a habit of showing up in small towns with a camera crew. By April, Atkins' name recognition, once his strongest asset, had started working against him. Voters knew exactly who he was, and increasingly, what they knew was that he had held the same chair for 6 years without a single visible accomplishment attached to his name. His campaign manager, a 26-year-old named Miles Sandoval, who had cut his teeth on 2 losing congressional races before this one, sat across from him one evening with a legal pad and the particular confidence of a young man who believed he had finally found the idea that would fix everything. "You need a number," Sandoval said. "Something people can see. Something that says Vernon Atkins doesn't let money walk out the door because a story sounds sad." Atkins looked at him. Sandoval tapped his pen against the pad. "The Kessler file," he said. "You've had it on your desk for a week." Atkins had. It was, by any ordinary measure, unremarkable. A routine survivor benefit claim, the kind the board approved 11 times a month without discussion. What made it different was the photograph that had run in the Millhaven Gazette the day after the funeral. A dead man in a leather vest, a folded flag, 600 motorcycles parked outside a funeral home that normally saw parking for 20 cars. Ask yourself what you would have done, sitting where Atkins was sitting. A file on the desk, a number that could win an election, and 11 days before anyone would think to check it twice. "He's a hero," Atkins said. The mayor called him one on television. "The mayor isn't running for state auditor," Sandoval said. "You are. And auditors don't get elected for being kind. They get elected for finding the one case where the rules weren't followed, and following them anyway, no matter how it looks." Atkins turned the file over in his hands. "Reclassification review," Sandoval said. "You don't have to say a word about the vest. You don't have to mention the club at all. You just have to say the words, voluntary personal risk, outside the scope of duty on camera, one time, and let the number do the rest. $1,100 a month. Multiply that by what the actuarial table says a 34-year-old widow cost this fund over 40 years. That's the number that wins you this race." Atkins had done that math before Sandoval finished saying it. He was not, by nature, a cruel man. He would have said so himself, and mostly believed it. He had approved survivor benefits for 11 years without complaint. But the number Sandoval had just said out loud had a particular gravity to it, the kind that made a man's better instincts feel, for just a moment, like something he could afford to set down. Marjorie Combs disagreed, and she told him so on a Tuesday morning, standing in his office doorway with the reclassification memo already read and already folded into her coat pocket like something she didn't want to be seen carrying. Combs had been the pension board's actuarial counsel for 19 years. She was 63 years old, precise in the way that people become when they have spent 2 decades finding the small mistakes hidden inside large numbers, and she had never, in Atkins' memory, walked into his office without an appointment. "Vernon," she said, "tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing." "The file needs review," Atkins said. "That's all this is." The file needed review 11 days after it was approved, not the week your polling firm sends over a memo about villain narratives. Combs set the folded reclassification order on his desk and put one finger on it, the way a person points at something they want a man to look at properly. For once. "I've worked with that charter for 11 years, Vernon. Every fundraiser this county has thrown for a burned house or a sick kid, they've shown up with a truck full of donations and never asked for a camera. You are about to take something from a widow 6 days after this city put a medal on her husband's casket, and you are about to do it in front of every single one of them." "They're a motorcycle club," Atkins said, "not a threat." Combs looked at him for a long moment. She had known Vernon Atkins since he was a junior actuary with better instincts than the man sitting in front of her now, and something in her expression made it clear she was doing the math on exactly when that had stopped being true. "I'm not telling you they'll do anything illegal," she said. "I'm telling you they don't need to. There's a difference between a group of men who break laws and a group of men who simply refuse to be quiet, in public, in large numbers, at exactly the moment a camera is pointed at you. One of those things you can arrest. The other one you can't do a thing about, and it's the one you're about to invite into this building. Rex Callahan's old charter used to say something," she said. "I heard Boone Sutter say a version of it myself, at a retirement dinner 2 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. He said his men don't react. They respond. There's a difference, and most people who find out the hard way don't get a second chance to learn it gently." Atkins waved a hand. "That's exactly the kind of talk that gets a man elected, Marjorie. Fear doesn't have to be reasonable. It just has to be visible." Combs picked up her coat. "Then I hope the vote makes you feel as steady as you sound right now," she said, "because I intend to make sure the minutes reflect that I said this to your face." She left without waiting for a response. The board voted 5-0 4 days later, in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes and drew no press, no public comment, and no attention at all beyond the 4 other members who had learned, over the years, that agreeing with Vernon Atkins was considerably easier than the alternative. People imagine cruelty announces itself. It rarely does. Most of the time it looks exactly like this: 11 minutes, 5 signatures, and nobody in the room raising their voice even once. Atkins signed the order himself. He did not, however, plan for it to be delivered the way it was. His instruction to the 2 field agents assigned to serve the notice, a clipped 3-line memo dictated to his assistant late on a Friday afternoon, said only that survivor benefits were to be terminated effective immediately and that any city property issued in connection with the deceased's service commendation was to be recovered per standard asset reclassification procedure. He had not specified how. He had not specified when. He had certainly not specified that 2 men with 6 years of city employment between them and a quota of reclassification cases to close before the fiscal quarter ended would decide, on their own, that a Saturday morning house call with no advance notice was the most efficient way to close 2 line items before the weekend. He found out what they had done the same way most of Millhaven eventually would, from a video Ruth Callahan posted from her porch that Saturday afternoon, 41 seconds long, showing 2 city vehicles pulling away from a house on Larchwood Lane, while a woman stood motionless in her own doorway. By Monday morning, the video had 87,000 views. Atkins watched it twice that morning, alone in his office with the door closed. Both times, He found himself focused on the same detail. Not the woman in the doorway, not the broken glass, but the two city vehicles pulling away at the end, unhurried. The men inside them apparently satisfied with a morning's work completed on schedule. He had told himself, reading the reclassification order before he signed it, that this was simply a number correcting itself, a fund protecting the people who depended on it from a decision made under public pressure rather than sound review. Watching the video, that explanation held for almost as long as it took to watch it once. Then it stopped holding, and Atkins did what men in his position generally do when an explanation stops holding. He called Miles Sandoval instead of Marjorie Combs. Sandoval's read on the video took him 4 minutes. "It's actually fine," he said. "Better than fine. It shows the board followed through on a decision without flinching, and a woman standing in a doorway isn't evidence of anything except that this cost her something. Costing someone something is not the same as being wrong to do it. Stay on message Tuesday. Voluntary personal risk, outside the scope of duty. Say it once, clearly, and let the fiscal responsibility numbers carry the rest." Atkins wrote those words on an index card and read them back to himself in the mirror that evening, the way a man rehearses something he has decided not to feel anything about. By Monday evening, he had a hearing scheduled for Tuesday morning, a prepared statement 4 sentences long, and no idea at all that Boone Sutter had already made 3 phone calls of his own. Wade had given her that card 2 years before the flood, on an ordinary Sunday evening that Diane would not have remembered at all if he hadn't made her repeat back what he'd told her. They'd been sitting on the back steps, the way they did most Sundays, Wade cleaning road grime off his boots with a rag, while Diane graded charts from her shift. He'd set the rag down without finishing, and gone quiet in a way that wasn't like him. "I want you to have something," he said. He'd handed her the card without ceremony, a phone number in his own handwriting, and the 6 words beneath it. "Whose number is this?" Diane had asked. "Boone's direct line," Wade said. "Straight to him. Nobody else answers this one." Diane turned the card over, looking for more. "When I patched in," Wade said, "there was a woman 2 charters over. I never met her, but everybody knew her name for a while. Her husband died on a supply run, hit by a drunk driver outside Casper. Good club, good men, but nobody had ever sat that woman down and told her what to do if the world came at her sideways after he was gone. She didn't know who to call, didn't know she was allowed to call anyone at all. By the time somebody finally checked on her, she'd lost the house, lost the truck, lost about everything a person can lose without anyone laying a hand on her." He'd looked at Diane carefully then, the way he looked at monitors during a bad shift, checking for something specific. "Boone changed the rule after that," Wade said. "Every wife gets a direct line. Every wife gets told, straight out, that using it isn't weakness, and it isn't charity. It's just what the club does for its own, the same as it would for me." That was the same rule Wade had described 2 years earlier, sitting on those back steps with a rag still in his hand. Diane hadn't understood, then, how many other kitchen tables that rule had already reached. "And if I never need it?" "Then you never need it," Wade said. "But if it's ever that bad, and I mean that bad, Diane, not a bad week, not an argument, the kind of bad where you've run out of every other door, you call that number, and you say your name, and you let him do what he's going to do next." Diane had put the card in a kitchen drawer that night, certain she would never touch it again. She thought about that conversation now the way she thought about certain patients from the ICU, not often, but completely, whenever something reminded her of them. Wade had never explained exactly what he's going to do next meant. She'd assumed, at the time, that it meant a phone call, maybe a lawyer, maybe a loan to cover a bad month. She had not imagined 500 men. She had not imagined a rule quiet enough that Wade himself had never once needed to invoke it in 11 years, and clear enough that the moment she said her name into that phone, Boone Sutter had known exactly which promise he was being asked to keep. She understood something else now, too, sitting at her kitchen table with the line already gone dead in her hand. Wade hadn't given her that card because he expected the club to break the law for her, or shout, or make a scene on her behalf. He'd given it to her because somewhere behind that quiet Sunday conversation was a rule older than either of them, that a promise made to one member's family was a promise every charter, everywhere, considered its own to keep. Nobody rode alone. Nobody's family was left standing in a doorway figuring out what to do next, either. Diane hadn't fully believed that rule was real until the moment Boone Sutter said, "Give me your address," in a voice that didn't leave room for the question of whether he meant it. Now she was about to find out exactly what it meant. Boone Sutter had been sitting in his kitchen for 11 minutes before he picked up the phone to make the first call, turning Diane's voice over in his mind the way he turned over anything that mattered before he acted on it. He was 62 years old, president of the Iron Line chapter for 19 of those years, and he had learned a long time ago that the men who reacted first were rarely the men who solved anything. So he sat with his coffee going cold and thought about Wade Kessler, not the medal, not the flood, but the 23-year-old kid who'd shown up at the clubhouse 11 years earlier with a motorcycle he could barely afford and a quiet, steady way of listening that Boone recognized before Wade ever said a word worth remembering. Boone had patched him in himself, had ridden beside him on more highway miles than he could count, had stood in a hospital hallway with him the night Boone's own daughter was born early and struggling, and Wade, 26 years old then, 3 years into the club, had simply stayed the whole night without being asked, because that was what he did. Boone remembered exactly what Wade had said to him at 4 in the morning that night, both of them still in the same clothes they'd worn since noon the day before, waiting on a doctor who hadn't come back with news yet. Wade hadn't offered comfort, hadn't pretended to know how the night would end. He'd just sat there, steady, and said, "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me to." Boone had never told him to. Wade had stayed until 7 that morning, when the doctor finally came out smiling, and he'd never once mentioned it again, the way certain men simply file a debt away without ever presenting the bill. Boone had been carrying that debt for 8 years. He picked up the phone. His first call was to Earl Whitfield, road captain of the Iron Line chapter, a man of 58 who had ridden beside Boone for 2 decades, and asked exactly one question before agreeing to anything. "How many?" Earl said. "Every man who can be in Millhaven by Tuesday morning," Boone said. "Colors on. No weapons beyond what any man carries lawfully. Nobody raises a voice. Nobody touches a city employee. We stand. That's the entire plan." "That's not a plan," Earl said. "That's a wall." "That's the point," Boone said. His second call went to Marcus Doyle, president of the Bitterroot Ridge Charter, 90 miles south, a man Boone had known since before either of them wore a patch. Doyle didn't ask how many either. He asked one thing. Stay with this next part. Somewhere behind those 2 words was a number that was about to cross 3 state lines before sunrise. "Was it Wade's wife?" he said. "It was," Boone said. "Then it's not a question," Doyle said, and hung up before Boone could say anything else. The third call went out to 11 charters at once, through a phone tree built for exactly this kind of morning, and never used more than 4 times in the 19 years Boone had run it. One of those calls reached a 29-year-old prospect named Cole Ferris, 2 chapters over, who had never met Wade Kessler in his life, but had heard his name told as a kind of parable during his first month riding with the club. The story of a man who'd once given up his own spot on a supply run so a rookie wouldn't have to ride an unfamiliar stretch of mountain road, alone in bad weather. Cole didn't ask who Wade was to Boone, or why it mattered. He asked what time to be there, and hung up already reaching for his boots. By midnight, the number stood at 200 confirmed. By 2 in the morning, it had crossed 400. Riders coming in from 3 states. Some of them men Boone hadn't spoken to in years, none of them asking for anything beyond an address and a time. At 4 in the morning, sitting in his own kitchen with the coffee long gone cold, Boone allowed himself, for the first time since the phone call, to feel the full weight of what Diane had told him. 2 men, a crowbar, a medal swept off a stand in front of a widow 6 days into her grief, the flag from her husband's casket still sitting, folded on the mantel not 10 feet away. Boone had not raised his voice once, to anyone, that entire night. He didn't need to. Diane, 60 miles away, had not slept at all. She'd tried, briefly, around midnight, lying in a bed that still smelled faintly like Wade's aftershave, on the pillow he hadn't used in 6 days. Sleep hadn't come. She'd gotten up instead and sat at the kitchen table where the 2 halves of the pension letter still lay, taped back together now, though the tear ran straight through the number that mattered most. She thought about calling Boone Sutter back, just to ask what "we'll be there" actually meant. She'd decided against it twice, and picked up the phone a third time before setting it back down. Whatever it meant, she understood by now that it had already been set in motion, the way certain decisions in her own line of work couldn't be unmade once the first step was taken. You didn't call a code back once you'd called it. You simply found out, one action at a time, what came next. Around 3 in the morning, she'd gone to the window at the sound of an engine on Larchwood Lane, and found nothing there but a neighbor's porch light and the ordinary dark of a street she'd lived on for 9 years. It wasn't time yet. She didn't know that. She only knew the street was empty, and went back to the kitchen table, and waited. At some point past 4, Ruth Callahan had knocked softly at the back door, still in her robe, holding 2 mugs of coffee she didn't ask permission to bring inside. She hadn't said much. She'd simply sat across from Diane at that same table, the way a person sits with someone through a long night shift, until the sky outside started to change color, and neither of them had said a word in almost an hour. "You don't have to know what happens next," Ruth said eventually. "You just have to be standing there when it does." Diane hadn't answered. She'd just nodded, and kept her hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. By 5 in the morning, the number crossing into Millhaven County stood at 481, moving in loose columns along 3 separate highways, staggered by 20 minutes, so that no single stretch of road carried more than 60 bikes at once. Earl Whitfield's arrangement, made without being asked, the same instinct that had kept riders alive on worse roads for longer than most men's careers. They did not announce themselves. No horns, no formation riding through town at speed. Just engines, moving steadily through the dark in groups small enough not to draw a single phone call to dispatch, converging on a gravel lot 11 miles outside the city limits that Boone had chosen for exactly one reason. It couldn't be seen from the highway, and it gave every rider a place to gather before anyone in Millhaven knew they'd arrived at all. By 6:30, the count was 504. What would it take for 500 people to leave their homes before dawn, drive for hours, and ask for nothing in return? Whatever the answer is, Vernon Atkins was about to meet it in a parking lot he hadn't checked yet. Boone stood at the front of that gravel lot as the sky went from black to the particular gray that comes an hour before sunrise, looking out at more colors than he'd seen gathered in one place in 11 years, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he raised one hand, not for silence. The lot was already silent, but simply so every man there would know he was about to speak. "Nobody talks in that room today except me," Boone said. "Nobody raises a hand, a voice, or a phone. We are not there to threaten anybody. We are there because a man who rode with every one of us for 11 years does not get erased from a ledger by 2 men, with a crowbar, and a chairman with an election to win." He paused. "We stand. That's it. That's the whole job today." Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. At 7:15, the first engines turned over, and 504 motorcycles began the 11-mile ride into Millhaven, arriving at the City Hall parking lot in a silence that would unsettle every person inside that building more than any noise ever could have. Vernon Atkins was already at his desk by then, reading his 4-sentence statement one final time, entirely unaware that the quietest morning of his career was about to become the loudest thing that had ever happened to him. Vernon Atkins parked in his reserved spot at 7:55, the way he did every Tuesday, and it took him almost a full minute to understand why the lot looked different. It wasn't full. That was the first thing that struck him as wrong. 500 motorcycles did not fit inside a parking lot built for 40 vehicles. They filled the street beyond it instead, both sides, for 3 blocks in either direction, engines already silent, riders standing beside them in a stillness that made the 2 television vans parked near the entrance look almost frantic by comparison. Nobody blocked his path to the door. Nobody said a word to him at all. He walked the distance from his car to the entrance past more leather than he had seen in one place in his entire life, and not a single person looked away from him, and not a single person looked at him with anything he could name as a threat. That, more than anything, unsettled him. His phone buzzed twice before he reached the door. Miles Sandoval, already texting from somewhere in the crowd of reporters near the steps. "This is fine. Stick to the statement. Numbers don't care about theater." Atkins read it twice and put the phone away without answering, aware for the first time that morning that he did not, in fact, feel as steady as the message suggested he should. Inside, the third-floor hearing room held 60 folding chairs, and by 8 o'clock, every one of them was full. Boone Sutter sat in the front row, Earl Whitfield beside him, Marcus Doyle on the other side. Behind them sat perhaps 40 more members who had been let inside once the room reached capacity. Chosen, Atkins would learn later, by an order Boone had given at 6 that morning. The oldest members first, the ones who had known Wade longest. A reporter from the regional affiliate stood near the back wall with a cameraman beside her, having driven 90 minutes from the state capitol after a producer saw Ruth Callahan's video crest 100,000 views overnight. 2 more journalists from the Millhaven Gazette sat with notepads already open, one of them the same reporter who had photographed Wade's funeral 9 days earlier. The other 460 men remained outside, filling the plaza in front of City Hall, in neat, unmoving rows, visible through the windows of the third-floor hearing room like a silent tide that had simply stopped exactly at the building's edge. Diane Kessler sat in the second row, Ruth Callahan beside her, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to Wade's funeral 9 days earlier, because it was the only thing in her closet that felt like it belonged in a room like this. Atkins took his seat at the head of the board table at 8:04. 4 other board members sat beside him, none of them meeting his eyes, all of them having arrived that morning to a lot they hadn't been able to park in and a hallway they'd had to walk through in silence. Marjorie Combs sat in the row closest to the board table, not among the audience. She had requested, in writing, the right to address the board as outside counsel of record, a request Atkins had approved 3 weeks earlier without reading closely, back when he assumed this hearing would last 4 minutes and draw no attention at all. People talk about courage like it's loud, like it announces itself. This is what it actually looks like: a folder closed, a chair pulled out, and one woman deciding to say something she knows will end her own job. He opened his folder. "This hearing is called to order," Atkins said. Agenda Item 1, Appeal of Survivor Benefit Reclassification, Case Number 4417. The board's position, as previously voted, remains that the death of Wade Kessler constituted voluntary personal risk, outside the scope of his official duty. This board sees no new evidence requiring further review. He closed the folder. "Are there any questions from the board?" Silence. "Then this matter is—" "I have a question," Marjorie Combs said. Atkins looked at her the way a man looks at something he had specifically arranged not to have to look at. "Marjorie, this is a closed procedural matter." "It's a public hearing, Vernon. I checked the statute this morning, since I assumed you hadn't." Combs stood, a single sheet of paper in her hand. "I'd like the record to reflect that as actuarial counsel to this board, I raised written objection to this reclassification 11 days before the vote, on the grounds that the underlying incident report, filed by the Millhaven Fire Department the same week of Mr. Kessler's death, explicitly classifies his actions as, quote, an act consistent with community emergency response training received through his employer, end quote. That classification was never reviewed by this board before the reclassification vote. It was simply omitted from the packet. The room had gone very still. "That report wasn't relevant to a pension board decision," Atkins said. "It's the entire decision, Vernon," Combs said. "You can't call something voluntary personal risk when the man's own employer already classified it as trained emergency response. One of those things is true. The other one is a number your campaign needed." Atkins's hand tightened slightly on the folder in front of him. "This board doesn't take instruction from a widow's attorney," he said, though Combs had never claimed to be one. "I'm not her attorney," Combs said. "I'm the person whose job it is to make sure this fund doesn't get used as a campaign prop. And for the record, I resign from this board effective the moment this hearing ends, so that nothing I say next can be dismissed as an employee protecting her position." She sat back down. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. One of the reporters near the back wall had stopped writing entirely, simply watching. Atkins felt, rather than saw, the shift in the 4 board members beside him, the particular stillness of men recalculating, in real time, which side of a vote they wanted their names attached to by the end of the day. Atkins looked at the 4 other board members. 2 of them were already looking at their hands. "The board will take the objection under advisement," Atkins said, in the tone of a man trying to close a door that had already come off its hinges. "This matter will—" Boone Sutter stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was already quiet enough that his rising alone changed the air in it. "Mr. Chairman," Boone said, "there's a public comment period on every agenda this board's ever published. I'd like to use mine." Atkins hesitated, glancing at the reporters near the back wall, at the cameras that had been recording since 8 o'clock, at the 460 men visible through the window behind him, standing exactly where they'd been standing for the last 40 minutes. 2 minutes, Atkins said, per policy. "That's more than enough," Boone said. He didn't talk about the flood. He didn't talk about the club, or the patch, or 11 years of road miles. He simply turned partway toward the room and said 4 words. "Earl, tell them Bozeman." Earl Whitfield stood, hat in his hands. "4 winters ago," Earl said, "I went down on ice outside Bozeman, doing 60 in weather I shouldn't have been riding in. Wade was 40 feet behind me. He got off his bike in a wind chill that took the skin off his hands inside 2 minutes, and he sat on that shoulder with me for the 11 minutes it took an ambulance to reach us, because I couldn't stop shaking and he didn't think a man should shake alone. I still have the scar where the frost got my knuckles before he got his own jacket onto my hands." He paused. "That's the kind of voluntary risk Wade Kessler took. Every time. For anybody." He sat down. Nobody in the room made a sound. Outside the window, nothing moved either. No fist raised, no cheer. Nothing to suggest 460 men had heard a single word of what had just been said inside. But Diane, watching them through the glass, thought she saw a few of the nearest riders take their hats off, all at roughly the same moment, in a gesture too quiet to be anything but genuine. Marcus Doyle stood next, without being asked. It was the same kind of debt Earl had described minutes earlier. Quiet, unspoken, the kind men like Wade never mentioned twice. "My charter had a member go missing for 2 days 3 years back," Doyle said. "Wade rode 200 miles on his own time to help us search a stretch of national forest nobody else would cover, because the terrain was bad, and most men had families waiting at home. He found him, alive, never once mentioned it to anyone outside our chapter, and I only found out he was the one who found him because another rider let it slip a year later." Doyle looked directly at Atkins. "You want to call that a man who didn't understand the scope of his duty? I'd like the record to reflect that Wade Kessler understood duty better than most men who've never worn a badge in their life." Cole Ferris stood third, hands visibly unsteady, clearly the youngest man to speak, his voice carrying less easily than the 2 before him but no less clearly for it. "I never met him," Cole said. "I patched in 2 months after he died, but I was told, my first week, what kind of man Wade Kessler was, before I ever knew his wife's name, before I knew any of this was happening today. If that's the kind of story this club still tells about a man 2 years after, that should tell this board something these papers don't." He sat down fast, as if the effort of standing had cost him something. Nobody else stood. Nobody needed to. Atkins sat behind the board table with his prepared statement still in front of him. 4 sentences he had rehearsed in a mirror the night before, none of which accounted for the sound of a room full of reporters writing everything down, none of which accounted for the 460 men visible through the window who had not moved, had not spoken, had not needed to do anything at all except stand there in a silence that had somehow become the loudest thing in the building. He looked down at the index card in his hand. Voluntary personal risk, outside the scope of duty. 4 words that had sounded, in Sandoval's office a week earlier, like the number that would win him an election. In this room, with 3 testimonies still hanging in the air, and a fire department incident report contradicting the board's own vote sitting on the table in front of him, they sounded like exactly what they were, a phrase chosen for a camera, not a conclusion reached by evidence. One of the board members beside him, a quiet man named Harold Greer, who had voted with Atkins on every measure for 6 years without comment, cleared his throat. "Mr. Chairman," Greer said, "I'd like to move that this board revisit the reclassification vote. In light of the incident report Ms. Combs has entered into the record." Atkins turned to look at him. "We voted 5-0, Atkins said quietly. "We voted on a packet that didn't include the fire department's own classification of the incident," Greer said. "I didn't know that when I voted, Vernon. I'd like the chance to vote knowing it." Nobody else at the table spoke. Nobody needed to. The silence that followed carried the particular weight of men who had already decided something and were simply waiting to see who would say it first. Atkins looked at Diane Kessler for the first time since the hearing began. She looked back at him and said nothing. It was Atkins, in the end, who looked away first. The vote to revisit the reclassification carried 4-1, 20 minutes later, after a recess Atkins had requested, and that Harold Greer had used to call 2 other board members he apparently trusted more than he trusted his chairman. Atkins cast the single vote against. Nobody was surprised, least of all Atkins himself. "The board finds," Greer said, reading from a handwritten note because there hadn't been time to prepare anything more formal, "that the original reclassification was based on an incomplete record, and reinstates survivor benefits to Diane Kessler, retroactive to the date of termination, effective immediately." Diane didn't move for a moment. Ruth Callahan's hand found hers on the folding chair between them, and Diane let herself hold on to it the way she hadn't let herself hold on to anything since the 2 men had walked into her living room 9 days earlier. Atkins stood up before the room had finished absorbing the vote. He didn't wait for questions. He walked out through a side door usually reserved for board members, and the reporter from the regional affiliate was quick enough to catch him in the hallway, camera already rolling. Stay with this. What Vernon Atkins did next was not the hardest part of that morning for him. That was still to come. "Chairman Atkins, do you have a statement?" Atkins stopped. For a moment he looked like a man deciding between 2 different versions of himself, one who could still salvage a version of the morning story, and one who understood there wasn't a version left worth salvaging. "The board corrected an error," he said finally. "That's the statement. Are you withdrawing from the state auditor's race?" Atkins didn't answer that one. He kept walking, and the video of him not answering it ran on the 6 o'clock news that evening with considerably more airtime than his 4 rehearsed sentences would have gotten if the morning had gone the way he'd planned. Miles Sandoval called him twice before noon. Atkins didn't pick up either time. Sandoval took a position with a different campaign in a different state within the month, and mentioned, in a single interview about his career 2 years later, that he'd learned early on that a number that looks clean in a strategy memo can look very different once it has a widow's name attached to it in a room full of people who knew her husband personally. He didn't name Atkins. He didn't have to. Outside, the 460 men in the plaza learned the outcome the way most crowds learn anything in the modern world. A phone lifted. A headline read aloud. A ripple moving backward through the rows the way wind moves through a field. There was no cheering. A few men removed their hats again, the same gesture Diane had noticed during Earl's testimony, and then, without any signal that Diane could see, the rows began to break apart. Boone Sutter came out to find her on the courthouse steps 20 minutes later, Earl Whitfield a step behind him. "It's done," Boone said. "Not a question." "It's done," Diane said. He nodded, the way a man nods at a piece of information he already expected, but was glad to have confirmed anyway. "Wade would have said thank you about 6 times by now," Diane said. "I don't know how to do that the way he would have." "You don't need to," Boone said. "This wasn't a favor. It was a promise. Different thing entirely." He didn't stay for the cameras. He didn't make a statement, didn't pose for a single photograph, though at least 4 reporters asked him directly for one. He simply nodded to Diane once more, turned, and walked back toward the street, where 460 motorcycles were waiting in the same neat rows they'd held all morning. Boone raised one hand, Not a wave, just a signal quiet enough that only the nearest riders would catch it, and pass it back through the ranks, the way word passes down a line of men who have learned to move together without needing to shout. The engines came to life in a cascade, starting somewhere near the front of the crowd and rolling backward through the rows like something enormous waking up all at once, block by block, until the sound of it had swallowed the plaza whole. Diane stood on those steps and felt the sound of it in the concrete under her feet, the way Wade had once tried to describe it to her, and she'd never quite understood until that morning. It wasn't loud in the way a single motorcycle was loud. It was larger than that, a sound that didn't announce itself so much as settle into the ground and stay there, the particular sound of something that had been very quietly holding itself back for a very long time, finally being allowed to move. She watched them go. Staggered columns, the same discipline that had brought them in, dispersing at the county line toward 3 different highways and, eventually, 11 different states, the sound of 500 engines, fading into the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning, until there was nothing left of it at all. Boone was the last to leave. He looked back once, from the edge of the plaza, and Diane raised a hand. He raised one back, and then he was gone, and the plaza in front of Millhaven City Hall was empty, except for 2 television vans and a scattering of reporters who had come expecting a story about an outraged mob and were leaving with a very different one to write instead. Vernon Atkins withdrew from the state auditor's race 11 days later. His statement, released without a press conference, ran 4 sentences, the same length as the one he'd prepared for the hearing, though the content could not have been more different. What would you have said, standing where Vernon Atkins was standing, with a statement 4 sentences long and 11 days to decide whether any of them were true? I made a decision based on what I believed my campaign needed rather than what the people of this city deserved from their pension board. I misjudged the character of the man I was reclassifying and the strength of the men and women who remembered him accurately. I owe Diane Kessler an apology I have not yet found the words for. I am withdrawing from this race, effective today. He resigned the board chairmanship the following week. The 2 field agents who had entered Diane's home were placed on administrative leave within 48 hours of the video crossing 100,000 views, and terminated the following month after an internal review concluded that no supervisor had authorized an unannounced house visit and that both men had exceeded the scope of their assignment. One of them, a man named Roy Pruitt, with 6 years of city service, sent Diane a handwritten letter 2 weeks later, unsigned by request of his union representative but unmistakably his, apologizing for the manner of the visit, if not, entirely, for having made it. Diane read it once and put it in the same drawer where she'd once kept Wade's card. She never answered it, and never quite decided whether that was forgiveness or simply exhaustion. Marjorie Combs's resignation, submitted the same morning as the hearing, was accepted without comment. She began consulting for 2 other county pension funds within the year, and made a point, in every engagement letter she signed, of including a clause requiring board review of any death benefit reclassification by an outside actuary before a vote could be taken. Harold Greer finished his term quietly and did not seek reappointment. When a reporter asked him months later why he'd spoken up that morning, he said only that he'd voted for 6 years without asking enough questions, and that watching 3 men stand up in a folding chair to defend a friend who couldn't defend himself had reminded him what the questions were supposed to be for. Diane Kessler went back to her hospice rounds the following Monday. Her supervisor had held her shifts open the entire 9 days without being asked, and never once mentioned the hearing, or the video, or any of it, which Diane found she was more grateful for than any headline the story had generated. The mortgage payment that had once stood 6 days away came and went without incident, the way ordinary bills are supposed to, the reinstated benefit landing in her account 4 days before it was due. She paid it, and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, almost nothing at all. The particular relief of a crisis simply ending, without ceremony, the way most real emergencies do, once the emergency part is over. 3 months later, on a Sunday evening that felt, in its ordinariness, like the first one that had in a long time, she sat on the same back steps where Wade had once handed her a card with 6 words on it, and reattached his medal to the wall herself. repaired, the glass case replaced, the frame level for the first time since she'd hung it. Ruth Callahan came by that evening with 2 mugs of coffee, the way she had on the worst night of it, and the 2 of them sat without needing to say very much, the way people do once the thing they were waiting through has finally passed. "You did good," Ruth said eventually, whatever it looked like from the outside. "I didn't do anything," Diane said. "I made 1 phone call." "That's the part people always get wrong," Ruth said. "They think the phone call is the small part. It's the only part that was ever yours to make." A week after that, Diane drove out to the Iron Line Clubhouse for the first time in her life, not because anything was wrong, but because Boone had asked her to come meet someone. Her name was Callie Ferris, Cole's wife of 4 months, 24 years old, newly married into a life she was still learning the shape of. Boone made the introduction briefly and then stepped back, the way Diane was starting to understand he did most things. Present, but never at the center of anything he didn't have to be. The clubhouse smelled like coffee and engine oil, and a dozen men Diane had never met nodded to her as she passed, the same quiet acknowledgement she imagined they gave each other, extended, without ceremony, to include her now. Diane sat down across from Callie at the same clubhouse table where, months earlier, none of this would have made sense to her at all. "Boone tells me you might want this," Diane said, and slid a card across the table. A phone number, and 6 words beneath it, written in her own handwriting now instead of Wade's. This is the part of the story easiest to miss. Not the 500 engines, not the vote, but a card changing hands at a clubhouse table, quietly, the same way it always has. "If it's ever this bad, call." Callie looked at the card for a long moment, turning it over the way Diane once had, looking for something more written on the back. "Does it work?" she asked. Diane thought about a medal, a torn pension letter, a room full of reporters, and 500 men who had ridden through the night for a promise made to a woman none of them had ever met before that morning. "It works," Diane said, "but I hope you never need to find out for yourself." "What do I do with it until then?" Callie asked. "Nothing," Diane said. "You put it somewhere you won't lose it, and you go on with your life, and you let it just sit there being true, whether you ever need it or not." Callie folded the card carefully and put it in her pocket, the same way Diane once had, certain, for now, that she would never need to touch it again. Somewhere along the way, this city learned to measure a man's worth in the language of ledgers and reclassification forms. The way certain people believe a number can settle a question that was never really about numbers at all. It couldn't, not here. Wade Kessler's life was never going to be decided by a line item, and the 500 men who rode through the night to stand silently in a parking lot proved something no memo ever could. That dignity, once it's been truly earned, doesn't answer to anyone's spreadsheet. It just waits, quietly, for someone to try and take it, and then it stands up. What stayed with us most, putting this story together, wasn't the size of the crowd outside that building, or even the vote that finally went the right way. It was the 6 words on a card in a kitchen drawer, written by a man who never got to see whether they'd ever be needed. Most promises like that are never tested. Most cards like that stay folded, unread, in a drawer full of things that don't belong anywhere else. The ones that matter most are the ones nobody ever has to use, and the ones that get used anyway, when the world leaves someone with no other door to knock on. This isn't really a story about motorcycles, or pension boards, or an election that didn't happen. It's a story about what people owe each other when nobody else is watching, and what happens when enough of them decide to pay that debt in full, in daylight, without raising their voice even once. Diane Kessler didn't ask for 500 men to ride through the night for her. She asked for 1 phone call to be answered. Everything after that belonged to the promise Wade made long before either of them ever needed it kept. Maybe that's the part worth sitting with longest. Not the size of what showed up, but the size of what it took to simply pick up the phone in the first place, after a week of doors closing in her face one after another. If you or someone you know is being threatened or harassed by a debt collector, or facing an unfair denial of benefits you've earned, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is at consumerfinance.gov. You have rights. You can file a complaint, and someone will answer. If this story stayed with you, If there was a moment, a detail, something you can't quite shake, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know, which part hit you hardest? If you're new here, welcome. Heart Tales is where stories like this live. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, in the quietest, most human ways possible. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, there are 2 more stories waiting for you right now on your screen. I think you'll want to stay. Thank you for caring enough to make it to the end. That matters more than you know. 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been around, 3 if you never miss.